Respected guests, esteemed faculty, and beloved students and cherished members of Voices from the Periphery, I'm Ayush, and it's with profound humility and heartfelt joy that we welcome today a scholar whose name evokes both deep admiration and enduring gratitude in the world of Indology, Professor Patrick Olivelle. To introduce him, in truth, an impossible task, for one does not simply list in achievements, one enters the presence of a body of work that has reshaped how we read, think, and imagine the intellectual and cultural worlds of ancient India. Professor Olivelle, Professor Emeritus at the University of Texas at Austin, is universally recognized as one of the most authoritative voices in Sanskrit, Pali, and classical Indian studies. His scholarship spans an extraordinary range from the ancient law courts and epic literature to the ascetic tradition and philosophical treatises that have shaped South Asian thought for millennia. His translation of foundational texts such as the Dharmasūtra, Arthaśāstra, and Upaniṣads are not merely rendering into English, they are luminous gateways through which generations of readers have entered the moral, spiritual, and political imagination of ancient India. But to speak of Professor Olivelle only as a translator or philologist is a miss of the essence of his contribution. He is above all an interpreter of civilizations, one who reads texts as living records of human aspiration, conflict, and negotiation. In his hands, the words from the past often looked away, sterling clarity. In this precisely this sensibility that makes today's lecture echoes from the periphery in ancient India, women speaking from behind the curtain. Such a momentous occasion, the theme invites us to attend to those who spoke in whispers, who appeared only plainly in the text framed by the patriarchal authority, whose words are often mediated or muted by male scribes and compilers. Professor Olivelle's work equips for such listening. His command of ancient archive, combined with his unparalleled sensibility to cultural nuance, allows him to reconstruct these fragmentary utterances, not to romanticize them, but to situate them within the complex structures of power, kingship, and the ritual that shaped women's lives in early South Asia. In an age with historical scholarship is often tempted by sweeping generalizations, Professor Olivelle's work offers instead the patient art of close reading, the humility to work with fragments, and the courage to acknowledge both the limits and the possibilities of historical imagination. On behalf of all of us, we offer our deepest respect and warmest welcome to Professor Patrick Olivelle. Your presence today is not just a privilege, it's an opportunity to listen together the quiet yet enduring voices from behind the curtain and to reflect on what it means to hear them. And now, thank you, sir. After you.
Thank you very much, Ayush, for your almost most generous introduction. And I'm so glad to be here with you all. Sorry, I thought it would be at 9:30 rather than at 9, but that's okay, we can start. Your project is called Voices from the Periphery. And I think it's a noble project. It seeks to gather voices that are normally silent, voices that normally cry out in the wilderness, voices that are normally not heard, and indeed voices that are often actively silenced. You seek to bring peripheral voices to the center, to make the periphery speak to the mainstream. That is indeed a noble undertaking, a necessary undertaking. And I'm delighted today and honored to participate in it. Yet, I have these qualms, these misgivings. Let me explain. We encounter serious and often insurmountable problems in recovering marginal voices from the distant past, especially from ancient India, which is the focus of my presentation today. Let us take a minute to discuss how voices, especially ancient voices, are preserved so we can hear them today. Lacking modern recording technologies which can capture and preserve voices and even images. The only way voices were preserved in pre-modern times was through writing. That is the issue of periods. There is an issue of periods before writing was invented and regions where writing was not used. But we will set aside that for the moment. Writing is preserved principally in two ways. First, we have inscriptions on hard surfaces, such as rock and metal. Second, we have writing on perishable materials, such as palm leaves, birch bark, and finally, paper. There is one factor that keeps peripheral voices out of these written documents from the past. People on the peripheral do not normally have the resources to bring their voices into these forums. Getting words recorded in writing is costly. Given the narrow segment of the population that was literate, both the services of scribes and obtaining writing surfaces were expensive. Further, there are often gatekeepers who keep marginal voices out. Writing was strictly a mainstream invention. The margins often did not participate in this technology. The second factor is that manuscripts, which is the format in which most ancient voices are preserved, have a lifespan of about two or three centuries in India. Unless they are copied and recopied continuously, they will be lost as bugs literally eat them up and climate turns them into dust. Unless there are institutions for keeping the manuscript tradition going, they are liable to be lost. Yet, all is not lost. There are various ways that these peripheral voices can make their way into historical memory. Some are accidental. The oldest such accident is from 3rd century BCE, and this is quite interesting. You all know about the inscriptions of Ashoka, engraved on pillars and rocks. The words of Ashoka are hardly voices from the periphery. They were written from the very summit of power. But the words of Ashoka were not engraved by the king himself. Instead, peripheral people, lorry scribes and stonemasons, carried out the task. One enterprising fellow was named Chapada, the only name of a scribe from ancient India whose name we know. He was from the far northwest of the Indian subcontinent called Gandhara, where the script in use was what we today call Kharoshthi. But when we meet him, he was working down south in Karnataka and writing in the more widespread Brahmi script. At the end of one of the inscriptions, he went rogue and wrote his name underneath. And he wrote it in his own native script, Kharoshthi. This is one very small voice we have. Indeed, I dedicated my recent book, Ashoka, Portrait of a Philosopher King, to Chapada with these words. To Chapada and his fellow scribes, engravers, and stonemasons, whose toil and sweat made it possible for Ashoka's messages to be read by us 22 centuries later. Unquote. And I may have added, made the writing of my book possible. Let us spare a thought for these little people who are often forgotten in the annals of history. Beyond that anecdote, however, the sources preserved from ancient India, for the most part, do not carry peripheral voices. Yet I think that such voices have left their imprint on the mainstream sources, but they are not direct, but mediated or reflected by mainstream voices. That is the plight of ancient peripheral voices. That is why I have called these echoes from the periphery rather than voices. But if we are to recover the lost voices, we have to settle for what we can get, the next best thing. We have to settle for the echo. Although, as we will see, there are some first-person voices, not many, but some, that can be recovered. One such echo reaches us is through the people at the center creating or mimicking peripheral voices. One could call this ventriloquism. Today, in the interest of time, I will focus on women. Gender was possibly the oldest category that pushed large segments of the population to the periphery. But we have the advantage of recovering their voices more easily than other peripheral populations, because women, though not of the center, were often close to the center in various capacities. We have voices of women preserved in very ancient texts, going all the way back to the Rig Veda. There we hear of a young woman named Apala, Rig Veda 8:91, probably in her early teenage years. She presses Soma for Indra, and the text records her words addressed to the god. Of course, these words are in Sanskrit and set in an elaborate meter. A young teenage girl could hardly have composed it. Here, the composer of the hymn is the ventriloquist, pretending to speak in the voice of Apala. Its scholars have sought ways in which this echo of Apala may give us insight into the lives of women, especially young women from that ancient period. The Upanishads provide examples of several strong women and their confident voices. Let us quickly look at some of them. First, there is the philosopher Gargi Vachaknavi, recorded in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. At a debate organized by King Janaka, Yajnavalkya, the hero of the Brihadaranyaka, claimed to be the most learned among the gathered Brahmin philosophers. And he drove away the 1,000 cows promised by Janaka for the most learned Brahmin in the gathering. A debate arose among Brahmins in a bid to test Yajnavalkya's knowledge. Unexpectedly, there was a woman among them. And it is significant that the authors of the Upanishad did not think this needed explanation. They did not take it as something unusual. When it is Gargi's turn to speak, to question Yajnavalkya, her questions used the metaphor of weaving, which was traditionally associated with women. She asked, and I quote, Yajnavalkya, tell me, since this whole world is woven back and forth on water, on what then is water woven back and forth? The words back and forth refer to the movement of the shuttle during the weaving process. Finally, after all the men in the group had completed their questioning and failed to defeat Yajnavalkya, Gargi returns to the fray. Her remarks at the outset are directed at her male colleagues, and they are noteworthy. Distinguished Brahmins, she says, I am going to ask this man 2 questions. If he can give me answers to them, none of you will be able to defeat him in a philosophical debate. Gargi here arrogates to herself the burden of finally defeating Yajnavalkya, something she knows the men in the group were not equipped to do. She is claiming to be smarter than all her male colleagues, except perhaps Yajnavalkya. Her questioning will settle the issue later. Her verbal challenge to Yajnavalkya is remarkable in its audacity and use of. Sorry, I think my computer went into sleep mode. Her verbal challenge to Yajnavalkya is remarkable in its audacity and use of martial language. She says, and I quote, "I rise to challenge you, Yajnavalkya, with two questions. Much as a fierce warrior from Kashi or Videha, swinging his unstrung bow and taking two deadly arrows to challenge a rival. Give me the answer to them." Even though we cannot be sure whether the conversation preserved in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad are the very words of Gargi, probably they were not. It is instructive to examine the context in which this episode unfolds. The fact that the composers of this Upanishad thought it important to insert a woman into the philosophical debate, and that they did not feel the need to explain what a woman was doing in this august assembly, all that tells us something significant about the position of women in ancient Indian society. It was, I think, more complex and nuanced than what is found in textbooks. Another woman given a voice in the Upanishads is called Maitreyi, one of the two wives of Yajnavalkya. Of the two, the author of the Upanishad tells us, Maitreyi was a woman who took part in philosophical discussion. Brahma Vadini is the term used. While Katyayani's understanding, the author tells us, was limited to womanly matters. The last statement obviously reflects a patriarchal view of women's interests. Yet the presence of Maitreyi and earlier Gargi shows that not all women fit into this stereotype of a woman's intellect or interests. To return to the story, Yajnavalkya was about to leave home and wanted to provide financial support for his wives. It is unclear whether he was leaving to become an ascetic or he was about to die. The two versions of the story preserved for us seem to support one or the other alternative. Maitreyi did not want money. She had loftier aspirations. She wanted something more than money. So she asked her husband this probing question. If I were to possess the entire world filled with wealth, would it or would it not make me immortal? The word in Sanskrit is amrita. No, said Yajnavalkya, it will only permit you to live the life of a wealthy person. Through wealth, one cannot expect immortality. This is the first time in the literary history of ancient India that the central concept of immortal is used in its Sanskrit feminine form, amrita, with reference to a woman. Maitreyi here seems to take it as a given that a woman has the capacity to aspire to become immortal. If immortality here expresses the ultimate religious goal of the time, as it probably does, then that goal was not beyond the grasp of a woman. Maitreyi then tells her husband, with a hint of exasperation, what is the point in getting something that will not make me immortal? Tell me instead all that you know. The issue whether women could become liberated, whether they could enter moksha, has been debated throughout Indian religious history. We have the famous example of the Buddha, who is said to have acceded to establishing the Buddhist order of nuns only reluctantly, noting that with the nuns in place, the Buddhist religion would last only half the time than it otherwise would have. The question of the spiritual capacity of women was debated heatedly within the Jain tradition. And the late Professor Padmanabh Jaini wrote a whole book on this debate entitled Gender and Salvation, Jaina Debates on the Spiritual Liberation of Women. Then there is the beautiful story of Satyakama Jabala and his, what I would call, a feminist mother, also recorded in the Chandogya Upanishad. It gives us in an indirect way the voice of another woman, Satyakama's mother, named Jabala. Satyakama apparently had no father. He was raised by a single mother. Wanting to get an education, Satyakama asked his mother what his gotra was. She gives him this honest and surprising answer. Son, I don't know your gotra. I was young when I had you. I was a maid then and had a lot of relationships. As such, it is impossible for me to say what your gotra is. Remember that gotra comes from the father. And she continues, but my name is Jabala and your name is Satyakama. So you should simply say that you are Satyakama Jabala. What an extraordinary and even feminist statement. She tells her son that he can adopt her personal name as his gotra name. No need for paternal intervention. And what is even more surprising is that the author of the Upanishad felt comfortable in narrating this story. But as I said before, although these stories provide us interesting and important windows into the peripheries of ancient India, they are nevertheless preserved for us and probably even created for us by the mainstream. They are echoes rather than voices. But if read closely and analyzed carefully, they can give us precious information about women and their place in society. A text that claims to preserve the original and authentic voice of women, however, is the collection of Buddhist poetry called Teri Gata, translated recently by Professor Charles Hellesey with the title Poems of the First Buddhist Women in the Murti Classical Library of India. This claim for authenticity is confirmed by Hellesey, and I have no reason to doubt it. If so, we have in this collection the very first authentic words of women preserved for us from ancient India. Not just echoes, but actual direct voices. One such woman, dubbed Arthaśāstra, half Kashi, was a rich courtesan before becoming a Buddhist nun. And here is one of her brief poems. There is a reason why I was called half Kashi. As much as the country of Kashi was worth, my price was just the same. That was once my value, after too many customers, my worth was cut in half. So she was called half Kashi. But then I had enough of what my body brought, and wearied, I turned away. May I not be reborn again in endless and inevitable births. I have seen with my own eyes the three things that most don't know, but the Buddha himself has taught. Another text that claims to provide us the voice of a prostitute is the Sanskrit drama Kuttani Mata, and we will come to prostitutes frequently in my talk. It's called the Kuttani Mata, or translated as the Board's Council, by the playwright Damodara Gupta. Here it is the prostitutes who are the main characters. They speak in the first person. Another lovely drama in which courtesan plays a central character is Shudraka's play called the Mritya Katika, the little clay cart. The translator Divakara Acharya says, Mritya Katika is a unique dramatic work which is hard to trace neatly in any one genre. It is an action-packed romantic situational comedy of manners that sketches a vivid tableau of town life in ancient India, while narrating the star-crossed romance between two unlikely figures. Charudatta, a Brahmin merchant reduced to poverty by his generosity, and Vasanta Sena, a rich and kindly courtesan. The courtesan Vasanta Sena is depicted as a respected member of society. When she is driven in a covered carriage, the watchman gives her free passage without inspection. His companion questions this decision, asking, "Who is this Master Charudatta and Madam Vasanta Sena that the carriage should be exempted from inspection?" His colleague replies, "What? You don't know Master Charudatta or Vasanta Sena? If you don't know Master Charudatta and Vasanta Sena, you don't know the moon with its light in the sky. Only two earn veneration in this town, its jewels, Madam Vasanta Sena and righteous Charudatta." We know, however, that the words of these courtesans were crafted by Damodara and Shudraka, just as the words of Gargi were composed by the Brahmin male authors of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishads. Here we encounter an example of ventriloquism that I mentioned earlier. Yet the strong courtesan culture of ancient India provided opportunities for the periphery to enter into dialogue with the center. That culture held a mirror to the self-absorbed and hypocritical culture of the mainstream. The Arthaśāstra of the Kautilya provides a good example of the pervasive nature of the courtesan culture. In the chapter on the layout of the king's fort, towards the south and southeast is the area, according to Kautilya, a section for the houses of prostitutes, thus providing official recognition to this provision. Further, one entire chapter, 227, is dedicated to the activities of courtesans, under the supervision of a mid-level official bureaucrat called Superintendent of Courtesans, Ganika Adhyaksha. This official also participated in this lucrative business on behalf of the state. Kautilya says, and I quote, "The superintendent of courtesans should settle a woman coming from a courtesan or non-courtesan family and endowed with beauty, youth, artistic skills as a courtesan with 1,000 panas as an endowment." What we gather from the Arthaśāstra and other sources is that these courtesans were respected and independent businesswomen. Some became very rich. So if you are searching for independent women in ancient India, women not under the thumb of patriarchy, these are the two, interestingly, the polar opposites of each other: the courtesan or prostitute and the Buddhist nuns. Interestingly, as Professor Gregory Chopin's studies have shown, within ancient Indian cities, both may have occupied the same geographical area, the red light districts. Nuns are often warned against behavior that may cause them to be mistaken for prostitutes. Both these groups of women, however, left their unmediated voices in the form of donative inscriptions. Looking at Buddhist nuns first, we have already seen some of their voices preserved in the Teri Gatha of the Theravada Buddhist canon. Gregory Chopin has provided us a clear picture of how these monastic women participated in the general practice of donating Buddhist sculptures to monasteries and temples. If you look at the numbers, during the Kushan period at Mathura, they are on a par with their male colleagues. Of the 21 authoritative inscriptions discovered, 6 are by nuns and 6 are by monks. If we add lay women donors, the number of female donors rise to 11. We have a similar situation in Sanchi, where 129 monks and 125 nuns are recorded. At Bharut, there are 16 nuns and 25 monks. And at Amaravati, 12 monks and 12 nuns. The picture that emerges is clear. Women in general and nuns in particular controlled or had access to financial resources that made it possible for them to commission such large and expensive donations and to have their names inscribed as the proud donors of the sculpture. Another interesting and significant feature of women's history of this period is revealed in the inscriptions that come from a few centuries after the Kushanas, that is, from the Gupta period of the 4th to 5th centuries of the Common Era. Donation by nuns virtually disappears from the inscriptional record of this period. Gregory Chopin thinks that this move to get women back in the kitchen or the nuns back in the nunnery may have been spearheaded by the rise of Mahayana monks, who, in the inscriptional record, call themselves Shakya Bhikshu, Shakya monks. Attitudes towards the public and economic participation of women and nuns may have taken a conservative turn around this time. There is an interesting parallel between these Buddhist nuns and Tamil so-called temple women or Devadasis, close to a millennium later, studied by Professor Leslie O. Temple women subsisted by providing entertainment in temples, especially singing and dancing, and also on the side by providing sexual favors to temple devotees. The inscriptions commissioned by these women are engraved on temple walls and give details of their substantial donations to these temples. These inscriptions can be viewed as deeds. One woman named Pillayar Chiritai Arivai bought a piece of land for the temple to provide flowers for the garlands given to the god, and gave another donation to support a gardener to take care of this flower garden. A donation by one Chengkotan Puwanti, another temple woman, gave 20 gold coins for food offerings to the goddess. These donations were perpetual endowments. The activities specified in the deeds were to be supported by the income generated by them. Inscriptional evidence from Buddhist and Hindu sources thus tell a story very different from the one normally told about women and wealth in pre-modern India. Professor Leslie Orr comments, and I quote, "The inscriptions show that women had a much greater public presence and considerably more economic autonomy than would be possible if women of this period had acted in conformity with the norms outlined in the Dharmasūtras. This literature defines women primarily within the framework of the patrilineal family, as wives whose access to wealth and property was severely restricted. Because of a lack of personal resources, a woman's religious activity was assumed to be dependent on the support and permission of a husband. The inscriptions, however, tell a different story." Unquote. Examining the corpus of medieval Telugu inscriptions from Andhra Pradesh, Professor Cynthia Talbot came to a similar conclusion, and I quote, "Another striking feature of the inscriptional corpus is the relatively large number of women represented within it. Women comprise 11, 87 in number, of all individual donors. This is certainly less than a proportional representation, but is much higher than one might have expected, given the limits placed on women's personal property, or Stri Dana, in the legal literature." Unquote. She notes, Professor Talbot notes that women even alienated immovable property, making land grants, for example, to temples. So there is a dissonance between the rules enunciated by legal and didactic literature, like the Dharmasūtras, and the historical reality of women's lives in ancient India. But these texts themselves, if we read them with care, and perhaps between the lines, tells us a second story. Let me turn to that now. The texts do acknowledge that women owned property, this text meaning Dharmasūtras. Such property is generally called Stridhana, women's property. Manu gives 6 kinds of such property, and I quote, what a woman received at the nuptial fire, what she received when she is taken away, what she is given as a token of love, and what she receives from her brothers, mother, and father. Stridhana is generally viewed as consisting of clothes, jewelry, and the like. The picture gets a bit blurred, however, because in their sections on crime and punishment, these same texts impose various kinds of fines on women payable in actual currency, coins. A husband is even permitted to fine his own wife, and I quote Manu here. If, after she is forbidden, a wife drinks liquor, albeit at festivals, or visits shows and fairs, she should be fined 6 krishnalas. Manu's prescription of a fine, even for an unmarried woman engaging in lesbian love, indicates that even unmarried women were permitted to have control of money. And I quote, if a virgin violates another virgin, she should be fined 200, paid 3 times the bride price, and receive 10 lashes. Katyayana, another later writer of the Dharmasūtra, in dealing with a wife's obligation after her husband's death, specifies women who have a large amount of wealth, called pradhana or adhika dana. Indeed, Katyayana is the one who appears to give us a more realistic picture of women's property in ancient India. On Stridhana, for example, he says, the father, mother, husband, brother, kinsman should give Stridhana to a woman of up to 2,000 panas, except in movable property. Yet Katyayana himself contradicts this provision elsewhere under inheritance when he says that immovable property given by parents to a daughter goes to her brother if she dies childless. This provision assumes that women did have control over land. The Dharmasūtras viewed a married woman's property as clearly separated from that of a husband. Such property was not part of the common family estate and was given the technical term Yahu Tuka. Narada is clear and explicit. The mother is master of a property, just as the father is of his. She is not able to give her property to anyone of her own free will, just as the father. If a husband took a loan from his wife's stridhana, he was obliged to pay it back. A husband was permitted to use his wife's property without repayment only in clearly specified circumstances, when other resources were unavailable. For example, a time of famine, for a religious purpose, such as the daughter's marriage, during sickness or imprisonment. There are clear guidelines for inheriting the mother's separate property. Some prescribe that it goes only to her daughters, and others to both her sons and daughters, but never to the children of her husbands by other wives. A husband inherits his wife's property only in the absence of her own children. Severe restrictions were placed around the property of women so that it would not be swindled by crafty relatives of the husband. Indeed, it is one of only 2 kinds of property not alienated by possession or enjoyment. Narada says, the property of women and the king is never lost, even if it is possessed without title for hundreds of years. Narada, for example, says that a document executed by woman is null and void. That's the theory. This theory is belied by the texts themselves, and of course by the inscriptions we have examined. Yajnavalkya, for example, clearly states that debts may be entered into by the wife and the husband independently of each other. And I quote here, the wife shall not pay the debt incurred by her husband or son. The son, a debt incurred by his father, or the husband, a debt incurred by his wife, unless it is incurred for the benefit of the entire family. Unquote. He also refers to debts jointly contracted by the husband and wife, debts that the wife is obliged to pay in the absence of the husband. These explicit rules clearly presuppose the independent agency of women in economic matters, including taking out loans. The Dharmasūtras, however, clearly state that a document with witnesses should be executed for each debt. Even otherwise, taking such a loan in the presence of witnesses constitutes a legally binding transaction. The ability of women to enter into debt implies their ability to execute legally valid transactions, including documents, as evident in the donative inscriptions contradicting the explicit pronouncement of the same Dharmasūtras. The Dharmasūtras also give us some clues to the disparity among various classes of society with regard to economic agency of women. According to the principles articulated earlier, neither the husband nor the wife is responsible for debts incurred by the other when the loan was not taken either jointly or for the common good of the entire family. Narada, however, makes an exception in the case of those groups in which the women are the wage earners and the husbands depend on their wives for an income. And I quote, "A debt entered into by the wife never obligates her husband, except in the case of wives of washermen, hunters, cowherds, and liquor merchants. Their livelihood and that of their families depend on their wives." Yajnavalkya's list of such men include cowherds, liquor merchants, actors, washermen, and hunters. These generalized statements refer to identifiable and probably stereotyped groups in which women were commonly thought, at least by the Brahminical authors of these texts, to be the wage earners. The implication is that there were segments of Indian society where women were economically more independent and where they supported the male members of their household with their labor and earnings. Women acting independently with regard to sex is also noted in the context other than prostitutes and nuns. We have two classical examples. The first is the institution of self-choice of a husband called Svayamvara, celebrated in the well-known story of Nala and Damayanti. Interestingly, this institution is completely absent in the Dharmasūtras and appears to have been limited to the royalty. The father announces the ritual self-choice, and the young woman chooses a man among those assembled. A similar situation is that of the so-called Gandharma form of marriage, celebrated in the story of Dushyanta and Shakuntala. Here, consensual sex between a woman and a man is viewed as the consummation of their marriage. The Dharma literature again restricts this form of marriage to Kshatriyas, hinting that sexual mores may have been different in the Vaishya and Shudra classes. in different segments of ancient Indian society, all Dharmasūtras. And they are a born man. Manu defines these three, and I quote, when in someone's house is born a son whose father is unknown, he is a son born in secret
আমি বেরিয়ে যাচ্ছি তাহলে একটু
to
যদি
the man who marries her. When a pregnant woman is married off, whether her condition is disclosed or not, the child in the womb belongs to the man
মানে
who
এখান থেকে বেরিয়ে
marries
যাচ্ছি
her and is called son received with marriage. Unquote. The jurists are here attempting to provide rules for dealing with children born out of wedlock. Clearly, some women refuse to be guarded. Another aspect of the sexual agency of women is revealed in the rules with respect to lesbian love found in the sections on criminal law dealing with sexual assault on women. Here Manu presents two possibilities. The first is when a virgin, called Kanya, violates another woman, that is, two young unmarried girls engaging in lesbian love. The second is when an adult woman violates a virgin. The translation of the term Kanya is problematic. It may indicate a virgin or simply a young unmarried girl. A significant and perhaps the primary way in which women became agents of their own sexuality is through the control of their reproductive cycle. The moral conflicts in contemporary society with regard to contraception and abortion are indicators of how emotionally charged this issue is even in otherwise sexually liberated societies. Male fear of female sexuality was especially evident in the area of menstruation and abortion. To some degree, males viewed menstruation as a failed pregnancy, as a sort of an abortion. Thus, a father who fails to give his daughter in marriage before the onset of menstruation is said to be guilty of an abortion every time his daughter has a period in his house. That women induced abortions, possibly through medication, is apparent in the severe punishments prescribed in the Dharmasūtras for such women. Funerary offerings are not made for women who have caused abortions or have killed their husbands. Significantly, these two crimes are juxtaposed, indicating the close connection between the two. Given that the child is often said to be the husband reborn in his wife, that there may have been professional abortionists, mostly likely older women, is hinted at by the frequent condemnation of such people. There are also indications that women did practice some sort of contraception that would suppress their menstrual cycle. One logbook provides severe punishment for such a woman, and I quote, when a wife suppresses her menstrual periods out of antipathy towards her husband, he should bring her to the middle of the village, declare her to be an abortionist, and drive her away from his house. The reality of a woman's life in ancient and medieval India was quite different from what the misogynist rhetoric of normative texts would have us believe. What I have attempted to show here, however, is that the normative texts themselves provide evidence that reality was not what the texts themselves attempt to portray, bringing up a question of method. It is easy to dismiss textual evidence as of little value for historical purposes. This, I think, is misguided and mistaken. Texts are as much part of the available historical data of India's past as are archaeological remains, inscriptions, coins, and art historical material. Unlike other forms of historical data, however, texts have a more intense form of authorial intentionality. The mediation of the author's mind and heart often obscures the view as much as it reveals. Different genre of data and different genre of text require different methodologies to uncover historical reality. Normative texts, whether they are theological, legal, didactic, or moral, need to be handled with special care if they are to yield historically useful data. As this small study has demonstrated, normative texts and legal literature, at the same time as they place limits on women's right to self and property, also reveals that women did enjoy agency and independence that would be unimaginable if we were to take their normative rhetoric at face value. What this little exercise has demonstrated, I hope, is that we can discover peripheral voices in the most unlikely of places. And that is the very act, and that the very acts of suppression, such voices end up revealing them. But just like an archaeological excavation, revealing these voices take patient digging in the available literary sources. Again, I'm delighted to have participated in your venture, and I hope I have given you all a few tasty morsels to chew on. And I thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for the
You're welcome.
lecture. Has been enlightening us. It's humbling. Your words today have carried us into the interior words of ancient India, where woman's voice, faint, often immediate, emerged from behind the curtain of the time. Through your masterful reading of these fragments, you have illuminated how the periphery is not a place of absence, but a site of unique, white power. What we have gained your lecture is not the knowledge of the past, but also a way of listening, attentive, patient, and willing to hear even the most specific echoes. Now, Professor, I hope you are feeling comfortable. Would you like to continue with the question and answering session now, or do you prefer that we send the remaining questions to you via email?
No, you can do it right now. That's fine.
Okay, sir. Okay. Then, with your kind permission, we would like to open the floor for questions, reflections, and conversation. We warmly invite our audience to join the exchange, whether through questions, observations, or thoughts asked by rich intellectual journey. So, I am taking one question out from my YouTube. There, Ornov is asking one question. He asked that, given that, sir, may I the question?
Yeah.
Okay, sir. Given that the majority of our textual evidence from ancient India is produced within male elite and Brahminical frameworks, how do we methodologically distinguish between the voice of a woman and the ventricularized protection of male authorship? Can the, in quote, authentic subjectivity of woman in such texts ever be recovered?
Frankly, it's very difficult because we can recover some elements of the lives of ancient Indian women, but whether we can, as your question implied, recover the unmediated,
भूख नहीं लगा ए भाई
unrefracted
खिचला नहीं
voices
यदि
of actual
भूख नहीं
women
लगा
from ancient India is is quite difficult. As I mentioned, we have inscriptional evidence which were produced by women. There too, we had to be careful because we do not know that the words that are inscribed are actually from these women, or whether there are the mediating voices that women told, make me an inscription saying this, and somebody did that. But I think what we find in Leslie O's investigation on temple women and their voices coming right on the walls of these male-dominated temples is very interesting, and that is a area where we may find some unmediated voices. The common wisdom today is that the Theri Gatha of the Buddhists are actually were written by those verses were written by Buddhist nuns, and if that is true, then I have nothing to believe that it is not. Then we have some unmediated voices, but as you can see, they are few and far between, right? So I agree. What I have tried to show is that we can get an insight into the margins, not necessarily to the marginal voices directly. See what I'm trying to say, right? So we can get some idea of what women may have done, what women may have thought, what women's life would have been like. But to get an authentic voice of a woman from way back then is difficult. For example, Ashoka has one little inscription, which is called the Queen's Edict, where Ashoka tells that donations given by my queen with a name, the mother of my son given name, should be, it's a bookkeeping thing, should be assigned to her account. So this is nothing to do with women, her voice. But this is very interesting that Ashoka's queen, one of the wives, had financial resources of her own, which she could disperse at her wish. And that there were accounting procedures to keep this money given into her account. It's like having so many accounts that you guys, when you get a order from my wife here to give, say, 1,000 rupees to these people, you should put it into her account. So that's an interesting bit, but these are bits of information that, but unfortunately, that's all what we have. So we have to work with not with the material that we would like to have, but with the material we actually do have.
Thank you, sir. Minmoy raised her hand. You can unmute yourself and ask the question directly to sir. Hello, Minmoy. Am I audible? Minmoy, you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly. Okay, until I think there's kind of problem there. I will take the next question.
Okay, I get you. Rinmoy, speak. Yes, we can hear you.
I cannot hear anything strangely.
You may speak. We can hear you.
She can't hear you, Ayush. That's the problem. She has a problem with her audio. Yeah.
So I'm just taking the another question. Then I will just take. So there is another question is asked by Rakhi. She's asking that most surviving accounts of women in ancient India focused on upper caste elite contexts. How can we meaningfully access the experiences of non-elite, lower caste, or enslaved women without collapsing their distinct personalities with generalized women's experience? In other
Yes,
words,
that's a good. Yeah.
yes.
Good.
In other words, is there a viable way to construct an intersectional history of gender from an archive so structurally biased toward elite narrative?
Yes. Yeah, it's a very good question. and there are, and I get your point that a lot of of what is depicted as women may not are not from the margins. Now let's take the issue of courtesans and prostitutes. Where would we put them within the class structure of ancient India? And that's a good question. And that's, I think, we are getting at least at one non-mainstream segment of women's population. And we get a lot more information on that front than we do about other women. I talked about Dharmasūtras talking about wives of lower class people, such as hunters and liquor merchants and washermen, and these are also not mainstream women. So yes, it is difficult. I'm not trying to minimize the difficulty of capturing the lives. It may not be the voices of these women, but there are one thing we have to do when we are reading these is, as you just pointed out, not to generalize it. So women do this, but what particular class of women do that? Some things that happen to women
খাবার বার ভাই
can be generalized. For example, areas of sexuality, areas of abortion and childbearing. They happen at every level of the thing. So there are, but I don't have a magic bullet to pierce through this. What we as scholars have to do is to be cognizant of the biases that are inherent in these voices that we get in the mainstream. The mainstream, as you rightly observed, is for the most part, not all, but for the most part coming from a Brahminical elite. And there are voices that are non-Brahminical, but most voices that have the resources to make their voices heard through the centuries in some form are in some sense elite. Otherwise, they would not have the capacity to do that, right? So that's the real issue, and that's the shortcoming with which scholars have to live and work with, I think, and there's nothing we can do about it, especially if you're dealing with text and inscriptions. Now, if you're going to archaeology and art history, we can have a different discussion there. But in textual matters, it is a drawback. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. We have some question in our chat box. So first, Ridhi Chatterjee is asking that, sir, as you have said, that abortion was prevalent in ancient India. So do we have any reference to the particular use of medical methods or medical herbs for abortion coming from midwives or medical practitioners in fact?
Right. So I must plead ignorance here. There was abortion for the most part was medical abortion. In other words, some kind of medication was used to induce abortion, and that's not a surgical abortion, right? To look at what kinds of medicines, what kinds of plant material was used to induce abortions, you would need to go to the Ayurvedic texts and the medical thing. And I'm not an expert in that. And that is something one can, ask people who who work in the Ayurvedic material, Professor Dominic Ujastek, Dharmasūtras. There are many others who work in the history of ancient Indian medicine who would be able to give us a better answer than I can.
Thank you, sir. We have take our next question. It's asked by Shovik Mondal. He's asking that whether is there any if reference we get the woman's view about the levirate marriage from the perspective of peripheral voices.
Leviratic marriage you're talking about.
Yes, sir.
Leviratic marriage. Okay. All right. Yes, that's the Sanskrit term for that is niyoga. And the niyoga is when a man is appointed to father a child on a woman for the benefit of the woman's husband. Let's put it that way, right? That's the way. And Leviratic comes because from a Jewish tradition. So this niyoga is the Indian tradition. The niyoga is generally viewed as happening when the husband dies childless. Then the husband's elders, grandparents, parents, would appoint generally, not always, generally, a brother of the deceased husband to father a son on his childless wife, right? And that husband, that child is viewed as actually the son of the dead husband, right? So he can perform funerary rites and shraddhas and all of that. That's it. You find this very clearly in the Mahabharata stories, right? That it's this Leviratic. And then there's also the question very frequently about important husbands, the husbands who are unable to produce children, who then appoint someone else, generally somebody who is closely related, to father a son. I do not know how this is related to voices from the periphery, but it does show a patriarchal view of women as bearers of children, right? There's a very ancient debate of to whom a son belongs. Does it belong to the biological father or the husband of the woman? So Leviratic thing clearly shows that is the husband of the woman, because biologically that person didn't create. But what I want to say is that how you can see the idea of woman is compared to a field. So, for example, I own a field and somebody comes and plants a mango tree in it. Who owns the crop that mango tree produces? The person who planted it or the person who owns the field? And there are voices both sides, but especially to say that the owner of the field owns the mango tree and the mangoes. The other side of it says that whatever the field, the seed that is thrown in will produce a different tree or a different crop. If you put rice, it will produce rice. If you put millet, it will produce millet. If you throw a mango seed, it will produce mango. So it is the seed that is dominant, not the kshetra, not the field. But all this shows that the women were viewed within this particular patriarchal view as in some way having no agency. It is that they are receptacles that are basically passive.
Thank you, sir. We will take two more questions only for the time constant. The first one is asked by Mrinmoy Rai. Her question is, when you say the texts are being written by men and they are the one who also write about women, so are they bringing in the women because they are needed to be brought in the context, or maybe why they are bringing them at all?
Yeah, right. So that's a very good and a significant question to which there may be a variety of answers, because authors who write text, as anybody who is writing a text today, will bring a particular perspective and the characters that that person brings into writing that book will be different in each case. So we cannot a priori say any woman that is brought into as a character must fit this stereotype. Different men may be doing it differently. In the Upanishads, a main feature of the Upanishadic storytelling is that knowledge, especially higher forms of knowledge, come from the most unexpected of sources. So there are voices that are not just women, but also animals. Animals take on a speech and produce wisdom. So that is one way of looking at it, I think. But whatever the reason a person may bring a woman character into a story,
বন্ধু
we
এটা
can,
পরে
I
শেষ করে
think,
দে
pry open some things that
কেন
may underlie that character
বাবা
to get us
ভালো না
into
লোকগুলা
a subtext of the text that we are reading, so that we can get some idea. For example, the fact that Gargi
কর একসাথে
is
খাবো আলাদা কেন
part of
খাবো
this team of Brahmins who are debating philosophically in the king's audience hall is itself rather strange
ঘোষণা করেছিলেন
and unexpected. What is more for me, I think, is that the creator of this character, the male author, does not take at all this appearance of a woman as somehow unusual, requiring an explanation. You know? Tell me more about what the hell is Gargi doing in this place. It doesn't require an explanation. Then this is where I think that then we can ask interesting questions about the place of women in society, because if the author didn't think that this required an explanation, it may be that his audience also took it as okay, as evident that a woman can be in this particular place, or it may not be. But at least these are the questions that we can ask of, even though we know that many of these stories are told and transmitted by women. What is even more interesting for the Gargi issue is this story has been transmitted through a line of Brahminical reciters for over 2,000 years. And nobody thought of doing something with it. In other words, nobody thought we should include or insert an explanation. So that's an interesting thing also with regard to the Brahminical male tradition, why this remained the way it was. Yes, anything, the last one, yeah.
Thank you, sir. We will take the last question, and it's asked by Pali. She's asking that in translating ancient Sanskrit and Pali sources that reference women certain culturally embedded terms, whether denoting roles, virtues, or transgressing, carrying normative meanings that do not map neatly onto modern categories. How do you and we navigate the risk of over domesticating these terms into familiar English concepts, thereby neutralizing their historical strangeness versus leaving them untranslated, which risk alienating the contemporary readers? And in doing so, how do you ensure that the in quote echo of the woman's world is not distorted in the process?
Yeah. Yeah, you're talking about the issues of translation, not just of ancient India, but of anything. How do you translate an African poetry into Hindi, right? Or to Bengali? Yeah. This process of translation is always, Italians have a interesting proverb saying, it's nicer in Italian, called traditori son traduttori. traditores on the translators are traitors because it betrays the original intent. And this is true especially of poetry, because poetry becomes much more difficult to translate. A law book is easier, right? A narrative is easier. But with regard to the specific question of nuances of meaning of Sanskrit or Pali terms from ancient India, how do you translate them? Dictionaries are useful up to a point, right? Dictionaries give you the generic. So what we have to do is to go deep into the cultural situation of the time and the place in which a particular text has been produced. This is not always easy. It's not always perfect. There's always room for
শেখর বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায়ের
improvement.
বাংলা লিখে পাঠিয়েছিস তুই? আয়ুষ,
Take the term,
পাঠিয়েছিস?
something that I had to
হ্যাঁ।
struggle with in translating the Upanishads. How do you translate the term Upanishad? Right. The literal meaning is evident. Upa, near, knee, down, sad, to sit, sitting down near, right? It has been viewed often as a group of students who is sort of forms a circle near a teacher, right? But this does not correspond to the way the Upanishad, the term is used in a variety of contexts within this, the world of the Upanishads. So then what you can do is to take a word in a particular text and see how it is used elsewhere within a similar context, in the same text, in other texts of the same period, and you come to a way in which you find an English word that can approximate this. There are always approximations, and often you have to, unfortunately, have footnotes somewhere or endnotes trying to explain what it means. But I agree with what you said, that leaving a word untranslated is basically a cop-out, right? You just leave the reader hanging there because you are supposed to know more than the reader, because you have done the digging, you've done the legwork, read, and you should know more than. And you can't just throw the problem at the thing and say, just leave it there. Upanishad, right? Because that person may get the meaning from much later times. Take the word Atman. So, okay, you can't translate it. All right, then just leave it at Atman. But of course, most Indian people today, or most people around the world, know what Atman is, or at least they think they know what Atman is, because they have heard it through the eyes of Advaita Vedanta and all the other stuff that has gone on in India through the last millennium or two, right? But is it what it means in the Upanishads? In most cases, no. Frequently, I have translated, and that's the meaning of Atman is the body, which meaning you would never get if you just leave it Atman, right? People will never think of the body in terms of the Atman. So this is where the translator has to mediate to tell the reader, this is what it means. But it's always an approximation. It's always an approximation. When you use the word body in English, especially because we are coming from a particular culture, which is Judeo-Christian, body is always distinguished from the soul, meaning the spiritual part. So you're talking about something different. Sanskrit, you would call it Sharira, right? That's the body. That's separate. But Atman doesn't separate it. It is you in your physicality, the whole of you. And that's difficult to get in a word in English. That's the real problem. And translations are always approximations. Good translations will make a closer approximation. A bad translation will not approximate at all. So it's always a question of choice, of words, of expressions, of sentences that can express what is there. One other thing about translation again is that translations also should be attractive, because especially if you're translating from a Sanskrit verse, there's beauty in it. If you're translating Kalidasa into just dead wooden English, you're not really, representing what Kalidasa wrote. So there's also the question of making it attractive, have a certain elegance in the English that the reader can appreciate, right? And that's a difficult task. I'm right now engaged in translating Ashwagosha's Saundarananda, and Saundarananda is a beautiful, beautiful work of poetry, of kavya, and English has to, at some level, give the reader an appreciation of this poetry. Okay, thank you all for listening, and I hope it was of some use. Yeah.
Then on behalf of Voices from the Periphery, I extend our deepest gratitude for generosity, clarity, and intellectual rigor you have shared with us today. Your lecture has been more than an academic engagement. It has been an invitation to think differently, to listen with greater patience, and to reimagine how we encounter the voices, silences, and the hard echoes of women in ancient India. We are truly honored by your presence with us today. Despite your health issues, you joined us, and your work continues to inspire us to approach the past with humility, precision, and a deep alternate to those who have been excluded from its official narratives. From all of us, please accept our sincere thanks for this enriching and unforgettable session, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.